Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast. This time, the history of war comics. The war genre is as old as fiction itself, and as long as humans have committed war against one another, we have always told tales about it, and like all other mediums, comic books were no exception. When Terry and the Pirates comic strip debuted on October 22, 1934, it used the Japanese invasion of China as its backdrop. Originally, it was just young Terry Lee who travels to China with reporter Paul Ryan to seek out a lost gold mine. Soon they found themselves with an ever-growing roster of characters while taking on numerous pirates in the process, hence the name. One notable pirate was Femme Fatale Dragon Lady, who would later ally with Terry and his friends during World War II. The series was created by comic strip legend Milton Caniff, who over the course of his run would craft one of the great comic book strips of all time. He would win the first Cartoonist of the Year award from the National Cartoon Society in 1946 for his work on Terry and the Pirates, while reaching 31 million readers across newspapers nationwide. Caniff would also create Mail Call strip for military publications during World War II, running from January 24, 1943 to March 3, 1946. The series was essentially a gag strip with the lead character, the raven-haired Miss Lace, mixing it up with GIs. It was noted for sexy depictions of Miss Lace, who was so racist the strip couldn't pass the censors of the mainstream publications, but did better in the military ones, as the brass knew a beautiful woman is already a great morale booster for men serving. After the war, Milton Caniff created another classic war strip, Steve Canyon, on January 13, 1947, about a World War II pilot who started a one-plane cargo service after the war, detailing his adventures with it. During the Korean War, he would re-enlist in the Air Force, and his pro-military stance would lead to the strip losing popularity during the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, while it never reached the heights of Terry and the Pirates, Steve Canyon would continue till 4 months after his creator's death, Milton Caniff, finally ending on June 4, 1988. With comic strips like this, it was only too long before the comic books, which were the original strips collected in magazine format, would follow suit. One of the first comic books, Famous Funnies, featured a war story in issue number 22 by Eastern Color, a one-page feature about the Battle of Manila Bay in 1936. It wasn't long before the genre soon started to gain popularity, as evidenced by the growing number of stories appearing in early comic book anthologies. K-51, a U.S. spy fighting the Germans in occupied Europe, first appeared in Wonder World Comics number 3 in 1939 by Fox Features. Speed Martin, an ace newsreel cameraman, appeared in the Funnies in issue number 45 in 1940, while American Ace was a skilled pilot and mining engineer involved in the war in Europe, debuting in Marvel Mystery Comics number 2 on 1939. Other comics were MLJ's Top Notch Comics in 1939, while Haley Publications did Sky Blazers in 1940, and Key Publications did Flying Aces in 1940. Considering a large number of comic book creators were Jewish at the time, their work in comic books reflected their views against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Germany, leading up to World War II. Originally, Captain America Adventures was a war comic starting out by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, two Jewish boys so incensed by Hitler that they had their hero punching out him on the cover in 1941, becoming Timely's first patriotic superhero. Soon, war comics came out in 1940 from Dell, featuring a diverse roster of characters such as Secundor, the Robot Master, Skyhawk, and Scoop Mason, a war correspondent. The comic would later be renamed War Stories with issue number 5, and followed by Wings Comics and Flight Comics by Fiction House that same year. Liberty Scout Comics was released by Centaur in 1941 as well. All of these comics were preceded the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. With that, the United States was officially in World War II, and the comic book medium went with it. Military comics, Ranger comics, and Air Fighters were soon produced that year in 1941 by Quality, Fiction House, and Hillman, respectively. War Heroes was produced by Dell in 1942, who also produced the True Aviation Picture Stories, True Comics, and Real Hero Comics. Devil Dog Comics was published by Street and Smith in 1942, and Boy Commandos was produced by National, also created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby in that same year, and continuing their comic books war against the Nazis. U.S. Marines was also produced by the Magazine Enterprises in 1943. Some comic books went beyond just promoting the fight against Nazis during World War II with their stories, but also helping directly with selling war bonds. Harvey worked with the U.S. Treasury with War Victory Comics in 1942 to help sell war bonds that went to supporting the USO and Army Navy relief funds. By issue number 2, it was retitled War Victory Adventures number 2 in 1943. Other bond-selling comic books were How Boys and Girls Can Help Win the War by Parents Magazine's Press, a one-shot published in 1942 as well. Much of the comic books produced during the 1940s were patriotic in nature, supporting the Allied efforts during World War II. After the war, the genre faltered, though the writing and the art were given a more realistic approach, as many of the comic book creators were military veterans who experienced war firsthand. This would be perfectly timed during the 1950s in the outbreak of the Korean War, leading to a revival of the war comic books in general. A number of notable comic book publishers during this time were Soldier Comics, Monty Hall to U.S. Marines, Tale to the Marines, U.S. Marines in Action, with the Marines on the battlefronts of the world, with the U.S. paratroopers behind enemy lines, G.I. Joe, Fighting Fronts, U.S. Fighting Air Force, Fighting Undersea Commandos, Fighting War Stories, Fighting Leathernecks, Battle Cry, War Battles, G.I. Combat, Battle Heroes, True War Experience, and Yanks in Battle. Atlas, the former Timely and Future Marvel, did Marines in Action, Battle, Battlefield, which was formerly Cavalry Romances, Battlefront, Young Men in the Battlefield, Battleground, War Comics, Combat Kelly, War Combat, and Combat Casey. DC did Star Spangled War Stories, All American Men at War, Our Fighting Forces, Our Army at War, and GI Combat, which it acquired from Quality in 1957. Charlton did Soldier and Marine comics, later Fighting Army, Fighting Marines, Fighting Navy, formerly Don Winslow of the Navy, War at Sea, Army War Heroes, and Fighting Air Force. EC did Aces High, Frontline Combat, and Two-Fisted Tales. With the 1960s and the end of the Korean War, the war genre slowed down once again, and the outbreak of the Vietnam conflict didn't help, as while previous wars did bring about a revival of the war genre in comic books, an unpopular one like Vietnam made them even less appealing. However, some publishers took advantage of even that. Blazing Combat was a war comic produced in 1965 by Harvey Kurtzman and Hugh Hefner, along with Warren Publishing, which was notably anti-war. Other publishers, such as Marvel, instead referenced more popular wars, such as the Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos and Combat Kelly and the Daily Dozen, preferring instead telling tales of World War II. Across the pond, the British were also producing war comics, such as Air Ace Picture Library, War Pictures Library, War at Sea Picture Library, Commando, and Battle Picture Library. D.C. Thompson launched Warlord, the first weekly war comic in Britain in 1974. It also produced Commando, which is currently running to this day at 5,000 issues and counting. IPC did Battle Picture Weekly 6 months later, which featured Charlie's War by Pat Mills and Joe Coughlin. And that is a brief and rambling overdue of the war comic genre. Now, we're going to do a much deeper dive into this genre, but with a different format than the previous History of Genre episodes of this series. Taking inspiration from the chief source of these episodes, War Stories, a graphic history by Mike Conroy, which tells a chronological history of war through comic books, beginning from ancient history and moving up to present day. Thus, we'll be jumping back and forth with which comic books were published at what time, but still provide the usual rambling and too brief history of the war comic book genre. So with that, let's begin with, the beginning of war. While ancient war isn't one of the more popular subgenres of war comic books, it still has some notable entries. The first and foremost is 300 by Frank Miller, published in 1998 from Dark Horse, about the legendary Battle of Thermopylae. Fought in 480 BC, in which 5,000 to 6,000 Greeks, led by 300 Spartans, against an invading Persian army whose size was reportedly as high as 250,000. It is a classic tale that has been retold countless times. 300 remains one of the very best adaptations, with many considering one of Frank Miller's best work in general. It was later made into a 2006 movie adaptation by director Zack Snyder, grossing $456 million worldwide, and still considered one of the best comic book movie adaptations to this date. And for better or for worse, gave director Zack Snyder the pull to do his The Watchmen and DC comic book movies. 300 wasn't the first comic book to tell the tale, though, as Lion of Sparta also gave an account of the Battle of Thermopylae in Dell Movie Classics number 439, which was released in 1962. Drawn by Gerald McCann, it was an adaptation of the 300 Spartans film of that same year, which also inspired Frank Miller to make 300 as well. Blazing Combat number 4 by Warren Publishing also did an 8-page story of Thermopylae in 1966, written by Archie Goodwin and drawn by Reed Crandall. Another tale of ancient war was the Trojan War, an ancient Greek myth most popularly referenced by Homer in the Iliad, in which the Greek nations allied to destroy the city of Troy when its prince, Paris, ran off with Helen, the wife of Menelaus and the brother of Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek nations. It remains one of the great tales in ancient mythology, featuring such heroes as Achilles and Hector, along with even the Greek gods being involved. On the comic book side, the most notable adaptation of this is The Age of Bronze from Image Comics in 1998, written and drawn by Eric Schofer, which sets out to tell a realistic retelling of the Trojan War over 70 issues. Of interesting note, recent archaeological finds imply that the Trojan War may have actually been inspired by real events. To date, Schofer has completed 33 issues of his planned 7-volume series and won the Eisner for Best Writer-Artist in both 2001 and 2003. Another comic book adaptation of this classic tale was Helen of Troy in 1956 in Dell's 4-color number 684, drawn by the great John Buscema. Other Tales of Ancient War was Nigella, written by Arle Mayer and illustrated by Estevez Pols in 2005 and 2006 from Marwood Press, which told the life of Rabbi Shaul HaNagid. In the comic, he is Nagid is called a poet, warrior, and scholar while becoming the Grand Vizier of the large portion of 11th century Spain under the Ottoman Sultan. In British comics, The Wolf of Britain appeared in Express Weekly by artist Ron Embleton in 1957 about Wolf and his band of raiders running the Romans out of ancient Britain. Heroes of Spartan ran an Eagle from 1962 to 1965 about Heroes, a Spartan boy abducted and raised to be a Roman senator's son, later enlisting in the army and shipping off to fight in Britain. Perhaps he fought against Wolfe at one point. Other historical British strips was Don Lawrence Carl the Viking and Lion from 1961 to 1966, The Wrath of the Gods in Boy's World, and later Eagle in 1963 to 64. Black Axe, A Saxon Adventure by Tom Kerr also appeared in Buster from 1960 to 1965. One of the most notable strips to highlight the medieval era history is the classic Prince Valiant strip by Hal Foster. First published on February 13, 1937 by King Features Syndicate, it was a Sunday newspaper strip that has run to this day, set in Arthurian times about Valiant, a Nordic prince from Thule near the present-day Norwegian coast. The epic strip is told in a unique format, using captions over war balloons along with realistic settings and stories, while still featuring tales of sieges, naval combat, and even early crusades. It remains one of the most popular comic strips to this day and has had many notable artists throughout the years, from Wally Wood to Mark Schultz. Even Picture Stories of the Bible, the educational comic from early EC Comics, gave tales of ancient war. In issue number 2 in 1946, the comic features a story by Don Cameron about an Israeli and Philistines battle. Amazing High Adventures number 5 by Marvel in 1986 by Mike Barron also detailed the story of David and Goliath. Valor by EC was a short-lived comic book series about medieval warfare, featuring stories from everything from Roman gladiators to 18th century revolutionary France. Created by William Gaines and Al Feinstein, it meticulously researched comic book with many notable artists from Wally Wood to Joel Orlando, but only lasted 5 issues, as it was sadly part of EC's New Direction line in response to the Comics Code Authority. However, like many of EC's classic works, it has been collected and reprinted numerous times, making for a must-read for anyone interested. Of course, war always follows wherever humans go, and the seas are no exception, with Navy combat a popular subgenre in war comic books. Most popular of all those tales are pirates, with Piracy being published in 1954 by EC, a bombastic series teaching everything we love about pirate tales, from sword fights to ship battles. Sadly, the series was released just before the implementation of the CCA, and despite the talent of such artists like Reed Crandall and Jack Davis, it would only last for 7 issues. Another was Pirate Comics in 1950 by Hillman, featuring Alpha the Slave Pirate, who fought the Romans in 52 AD. El Cazador, the Hunter, by writer Chuck Dixon, was also produced in 2003 by CrossGen. Released just after the hugely successful Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and thus became the company's fastest-selling first issue. However, it would quickly go down when CrossGen folded the next year and Disney acquired all their assets. My Monkey's Name is Jennifer was produced in 2002 by Ken Kirsten and SLG Publishing, which was, of all things, a pirate musical. Isaac the Pirate by Christopher Blaine and MBM was also produced around that same time. Most notoriously, though, there was Captain Piscones and His Pervert Pirates in Zap Comics in 1968 by Brent Mint and S. Clay Wilson. In his most notable place in history, though, is when Will Eisner read one of these stories at a convention where a pirate chops off another pirate's penis and eats it, nearly dissuading Eisner from working with Kitchen Sink Press. Luckily, Dennis Kitchen was able to convince him otherwise. Moving to the 19th century, one of the most popular historical figures to tell stories about was Napoleon Bonaparte, the dictator of France who nearly conquered all of Europe, and is still considered one of the greatest military minds of all time. True Comics detailed the Battle of Waterloo in 1942 by artist William McArdle in issue number 2, which saw his final defeat at the hands of a British army led by Duke Wellington and the Prussian army led by Field Marshal Blucher. Cavalcade of England covered in the Napoleonic Wars initiated